The officers stood at the edge of the street, scanning the dimming horizon. The fading sunlight made the city feel quieter, almost ghostly. There was no one around. The usual rush of people was gone, replaced by the calm that settled just before nightfall. In the distance, a homeless man shuffled along, dragging his feet as he pushed an old shopping cart piled high with bags. His appearance was enough to make anyone avoid eye contact: dirty clothes, tangled hair, and shoes so worn they barely held together. For the officers, it was just another routine shift. They had seen countless individuals like him, the disheveled, the lost, the ones who needed help but rejected it, too proud or too broken to ask. It was a regular part of their job to check on the homeless in the area, but this time something felt different. The man didn't appear to notice them at first. He kept his head down, his eyes hidden under the brim of a torn baseball cap. But as he passed the officers, he stopped. Not because they asked him to, but because it seemed like something else had stopped him. Something deeper. Something that didn't belong. He turned slowly, locking eyes with one of the officers. The officer felt a chill run down his spine, even though the air was warm. There was something unsettling about the look. The man's gaze was piercing, as though he saw through the uniform, through everything. It was a quiet defiance, a silent challenge that made the officer question his next move. "Need help?" the officer asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. There was no sign of aggression, but something about the situation made him uneasy. The man didn't respond at first. Instead, he studied the officer as if weighing something. After what seemed like an eternity, he nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "All right," the officer said, his tone shifting slightly. "Let's get you to the shelter." Without warning, the man shook his head. "No," he said quietly, his voice gravelly but firm. "I don't need help." The officer, a little thrown by the response, glanced at his partner. They had dealt with many like him, people who refused help, people who wandered the streets because they had no place to go. But this man felt different. There was something off about him, something that made the officer hesitate. He stepped forward, lowering his voice. "You sure about that? There's a place nearby. Warm food, a bed." The man shook his head again. "Not today," he said softly. And with that, he turned and began walking away. He didn't hurry, didn't seem to be in any particular rush. But there was something about the way he moved, a deliberate calmness, that unsettled the officer. As the man walked, the officer's eyes followed him, and something deep in his gut told him that this wasn't just another homeless person, this was something more. The man stopped again. This time, he turned down a narrow alleyway on the left, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The officer, instinctively, took a step forward. "Hey, wait up," he called. "Where are you going?" The man didn't answer. He just disappeared into the shadows of the alley. The officers exchanged glances. There was something odd about the way he moved. No frantic shuffling. No desperation. Just a quiet calm that felt out of place in this city, where desperation and fear were the usual companions of the homeless. Against his better judgment, the officer nodded to his partner. "Let's follow him." The narrow alleyway was dim, lit only by the occasional flicker of a streetlight. They moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the layers of grime and old newspapers on the ground. The air was thick with the smell of garbage, but it didn't mask the strange feeling that lingered in their chests. They reached the mouth of the alley. The homeless man was nowhere to be seen. "Where did he go?" the officer muttered, his voice low. The alley stretched further than he had expected. It wasn't just a dead end like most of the alleyways in this part of the city. There was something unsettling about how the shadows seemed to twist and curl, swallowing up the light. They moved further in, their flashlights cutting through the dark. Then they heard it. A soft click. The sound of something shifting in the distance. The officers froze. It wasn't a sound they'd expected in an alley, no rats scurrying, no distant footsteps. Just that one click. They looked at each other, confusion creeping in. The alley felt strangely long now, as though it extended beyond the limits of the city itself. It felt endless. And then, out of the darkness, the homeless man reappeared. He stood at the far end of the alley, just outside the beam of their flashlights. His silhouette was barely visible against the dark backdrop. For a moment, the officers just stood there, unsure of what to do. The man wasn't moving. He was simply standing there, waiting. Then, one of the officers spoke. "How did you?" But before he could finish his sentence, the man did something that would forever change everything. He stepped forward into the light. The officer's breath caught in his throat. The man's face wasn't as it seemed. Beneath the layers of dirt and grime, there was a sharpness, a familiarity. A recognition. It was only for a brief second, but in that instant, the officer realized something. This man wasn't homeless. He wasn't a man at all, at least not in the way they thought. The officer's mind raced. He glanced at his partner, who was staring in disbelief. The man's face, it wasn't just a face. It was the face of someone they knew, a face from years ago, someone they thought was long gone. But before they could act, the man turned and disappeared into the shadows once more, leaving behind nothing but a lingering sense of confusion and dread. For a moment, the officers just stood there, staring at the empty alley. "What the hell was that?" one of them whispered. They had no answers. Only more questions. And the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The alley was quiet again. The only sound was the soft rustling of paper caught in the wind. The homeless man, the one who had just vanished, was gone, as if he'd never been there. The officers stood frozen in place, their flashlights trembling in their hands. There was no sign of him now, nothing but the dim light of the streetlights casting long shadows across the alley. "I don't understand," one of the officers whispered, his voice barely audible. "How could he just disappear like that?" The other officer shook his head, his mind racing. He had seen a lot in his career, but nothing like this. Nothing that left him feeling so unsettled, so uncertain. They had seen countless homeless individuals come and go through these streets, but none of them had ever left an impression like this man had. "Let's keep looking," the first officer said, breaking the silence. He couldn't have gone far. They started to move forward, carefully scanning the alley for any sign of the man. The flickering streetlights barely illuminated the path ahead, but they pressed on, their senses alert. With every step they took, the air seemed to grow heavier, as though the alley itself was closing in around them. Minutes passed, but there was no trace of the man. No sounds. No movement. The alley stretched on endlessly, twisting in ways they didn't remember. They had walked this path many times before, but it felt different now, foreign, unnerving. "What's going on here?" the second officer muttered, glancing around. His voice sounded shaky, betraying his calm exterior. "How can this be?" Just then, they heard it again, the click. That soft, almost imperceptible sound, like something shifting in the distance. Both officers froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. They looked at each other, their faces pale. "Did you hear that?" the first officer asked, his voice tight with anxiety. The second officer nodded, his grip tightening on his flashlight. "Yeah. I heard it." They moved cautiously toward the source of the sound, their steps slow and deliberate. The alley seemed to stretch farther than it should have, as though it was playing tricks on their minds. Each turn, each corner, felt like it was leading them deeper into the unknown. Then, they saw something that made their blood run cold. At the far end of the alley, just beyond the reach of their flashlights, the homeless man appeared once again. This time, however, he was standing motionless, his back to them. He was facing a wall, but his posture was rigid, unnatural. It was as though he were waiting for something or someone. The officers didn't move. They couldn't. They were transfixed by the sight in front of them. The man was completely still, not even turning to acknowledge their presence. There was an eerie silence that hung in the air, as though the world itself had stopped. "What do we do now?" the second officer asked in a whisper, his voice trembling. "Should we approach him?" The first officer hesitated. "We don't know who he is. We don't know what he's capable of." But before they could decide, something strange happened. The man turned slowly, deliberately, as if sensing their presence before they even made a sound. His face, which had once been hidden beneath layers of grime and dirt, was now fully exposed. But it wasn't just the grime that covered his features, there was something else. A mask, or perhaps a disguise, that seemed to distort his appearance. The officers couldn't place it at first. It was as though his face was a patchwork of different people, different identities all stitched together. And then the man spoke. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice low and gravelly, yet strangely calm. "None of you are." The officers took a step back, confusion and fear taking root in their minds. What did he mean? Who was he? Why did he seem so different? The first officer swallowed hard. "What do you mean? Who are you?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he seemed to look them over, as if sizing them up. His eyes, those piercing, unnerving eyes, seemed to look right through them, as though he could see everything they were thinking, every fear they were hiding. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the man spoke again. "My name doesn't matter," he said. "But what I'm about to tell you will change everything." The officers exchanged nervous glances. The air between them seemed to thicken, heavy with unspoken tension. "What do you mean?" the second officer asked, his voice shaky. "What's going on?" The man's eyes narrowed. "You're not the only ones who are lost," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You've been searching for something. Something that doesn't exist, but you keep looking. You keep trying to find it, even though it's right in front of you." The officers stood there, bewildered, unsure of what he was talking about. They had been trained to handle all sorts of situations, but this was something else entirely. This wasn't just a homeless man on the streets. This was someone who knew something they didn't, a secret, a truth that was just out of their reach. "Who are you?" the first officer demanded, stepping forward. "What do you know about us?" The man didn't flinch. He simply stared at them, his expression unreadable. And then, he did something that no one could have expected. He reached into his coat, pulling out a small, weathered notebook. The pages were yellowed and torn, as though it had been through countless years of wear. He held it up, and for the first time, the officers saw the writing on the cover. It was in a language they didn't recognize. "What is this?" the second officer asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. The man didn't answer right away. He just stared at the notebook, his fingers gently tracing the edges of the pages. "You don't understand," he said finally. "But you will. You have to." The officers exchanged another look. This was getting stranger by the minute. What was going on? Who was this man, and why was he so cryptic? Suddenly, the man turned and walked toward the alley's exit, his steps swift and purposeful. The officers, unsure of what to do, followed him. There was a magnetic pull, an invisible force drawing them forward. They didn't know why they couldn't just leave. Something told them they had to follow him. And so, they did. As they walked behind him, they noticed something odd. The alleyway, which had seemed so endless before, now looked different. It was shorter, narrower. The walls seemed to press in on them, as though the entire alley had shifted. The darkness around them deepened, and the city sounds grew faint, almost non-existent. "What's happening?" the first officer asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The second officer didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was too consumed with the strangeness of the situation. Every step they took felt like they were moving further from reality, into something they couldn't explain. They reached the end of the alley. But it wasn't the end they remembered. Instead, the alley opened up into a small courtyard, surrounded by crumbling buildings. In the center of the courtyard was an old well, its stone edges covered in moss. The homeless man stopped beside the well and turned to face the officers. "You want answers?" he asked. "You'll find them here. But you're not ready for what you're about to discover." The officers stood frozen, their hearts racing. They didn't know whether to take a step forward or turn and run. But something deep inside told them they had no choice. They had to find out what this man knew. They had to learn the truth. And so, they stepped forward, knowing that what lay ahead would change everything. The courtyard was eerily silent, save for the soft hum of the wind brushing against the crumbling buildings around them. The air was thick with tension, every breath the officers took feeling heavier than the last. The homeless man stood in front of the well, his expression unreadable, his eyes still locked on the officers. For a moment, the two officers just stared at him. The scene felt surreal, as if they were part of a strange dream they couldn't wake up from. Nothing about this situation made sense. Everything they thought they knew about the world, their city, their lives, was slipping away, replaced by something far darker, far more complicated. The first officer swallowed hard, his throat dry. "What do you mean we'll find answers here?" The homeless man didn't respond right away. He simply gestured to the well. His hands were steady, even though his body seemed worn and frail. He looked like someone who had lived 1,000 lives. Someone who had seen too much to ever be shaken by anything again. It was unsettling. "You think you know the truth?" the man asked, his voice low, barely above a whisper. "The truth is, none of you are ready for it. But once you open this door, once you look into what lies beneath, there's no turning back." The officers exchanged nervous glances. The man's words were like a warning, but it wasn't just a warning. It felt like a challenge, a test of some kind. And yet, there was a part of them that couldn't turn away. They were drawn to the mystery, to the promise of answers. The promise of something they had been seeking, even if they didn't understand why. The second officer spoke, his voice trembling. "What's in the well? What are you hiding from us?" The man gave him a sharp, piercing look, his eyes narrowing. "It's not what's hidden. It's what you choose to see." With that, he stepped aside, making way for the officers to approach the well. The stone structure was old, worn down by years of neglect. The moss-covered edges seemed to pulse with a life of their own, as though the well itself was a living thing. The officers stood there for a moment, hesitant, unsure of what to do next. "Go ahead," the homeless man said softly. "Look into it." The first officer moved forward, his flashlight in hand, but his steps were slow, as if he was walking towards something that could destroy him. The second officer stayed behind, watching him with wide, wary eyes. He didn't want to look into the well. Something about it felt wrong. Like there was a force pulling him away from it, urging him to leave this place before it was too late. But the first officer was determined. He had to know. He had to understand. This was his job, his duty. He wasn't going to walk away from something so strange, so powerful, not when he was this close to finding the answers. He leaned over the well, shining his flashlight into the darkness below. The beam of light cut through the blackness, revealing nothing but empty space. The well seemed bottomless, its depth stretching into an unknown void. He couldn't see anything at first, nothing except the darkness staring back at him. Then, something shifted. A faint glow appeared at the bottom, too dim to make out at first. It flickered, like a distant star, far below the surface. The officer leaned in closer, squinting to get a better look. As his eyes adjusted to the dark, he saw shapes moving, swirling in the depths. For a split second, he thought he saw faces. Faces of people, their expressions frozen in a state of agony. But when he blinked, they were gone, swallowed by the darkness once again. He stepped back quickly, his heart pounding. What was that? The second officer moved closer, peering into the well as well. But when he looked down, there was nothing. No glowing light. No faces. Just the empty blackness. What did you see? The second officer asked. His voice shaky. He didn't want to ask. He didn't want to know. But something inside of him urged him to keep asking, to keep pushing. The first officer turned, his face pale, his eyes wide. I don't know. It was something. Something I can't explain. I thought I saw people, faces, maybe. But they weren't real. I don't know what I saw. The homeless man watched them with a steady gaze, as if he had expected this reaction. His lips barely moved as he spoke. It's not the well you need to fear. It's the answers you'll find. The second officer swallowed hard, his fear creeping up his spine. What does that mean? What's down there? The homeless man's eyes seemed to darken, as if the weight of his words were too much for him to bear. The truth is down there. The things you're not ready to face. The things that were hidden from you for a reason. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The first officer's hands trembled. He couldn't ignore the pull he felt, the need to understand what was in that well, what lay beneath the surface. He looked back down into the darkness, but this time, he wasn't afraid. He was determined. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a rope. I'm going down, he said, his voice firm. No, the second officer said quickly, grabbing his arm. You can't. We don't know what's down there. We don't even know what we're dealing with. But the first officer shook him off. I have to know. I have to see for myself. If we don't, we'll never get the answers we need. The second officer hesitated, his mind torn between the desire to stop him and the fear that something was pushing him forward, pulling him toward the well as well. He finally nodded, reluctantly, and stepped aside. The first officer tied the rope around a nearby post, testing it for strength before carefully lowering himself into the well. The darkness enveloped him as he descended, his flashlight flickering in the blackness. The sound of his breathing echoed off the walls as he slowly sank deeper, the stone walls pressing in on him. Every inch he descended felt like a step further away from the world he knew, further into the unknown. Then, suddenly, his foot hit something solid. He looked down, surprised to see the stone floor beneath him. He had expected the well to be deeper, to stretch on forever. But instead, he had landed on something solid, something that felt almost like a door. His heart raced as he knelt down, brushing his fingers over the stone surface. It was smooth, cold, and unmistakably man-made. There was no way this could have been part of the well's original construction. This was something else. Something placed here on purpose. He pushed against the stone, his muscles straining as he tried to move it. At first, it didn't budge. But with a grunt, he pushed harder, and the stone shifted, revealing a narrow opening. The first officer's breath caught in his throat as he peered inside. It was too dark to see clearly, but there was a faint glow coming from within. He couldn't tell what it was, but it called to him, beckoned him forward. He took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage he had left, and crawled through the narrow opening. What he found on the other side was something no one could have prepared for. The space was small, but there was enough light for him to see what was around him. There were symbols carved into the walls, strange, unfamiliar symbols that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. The air felt thick, heavy, as though it had been sealed for centuries. It was as if he had stepped into a different world entirely. But what shocked him the most was the object in the center of the room. It was a large, crystal-like structure, glowing with an otherworldly light. It seemed to hum, as if it were alive. The officer reached out, his hand trembling, but just as he touched the crystal, a sharp, piercing pain shot through his body. He screamed, but the sound was muffled by the thick walls of the chamber. His vision blurred, and the world around him seemed to distort, twisting and warping like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the pain stopped. The officer collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. His body ached, his mind spinning with confusion and terror. He looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But nothing made sense. He had just touched something that wasn't of this world. And that's when he saw it. A shadow moved in the corner of the room. It was the homeless man. He was standing there, watching him with those cold, piercing eyes. But now, there was something different about him. He was no longer the frail, disheveled figure he had once been. His posture was upright, his presence commanding. The officer could barely catch his breath as he whispered, "Who are you?" The homeless man smiled, a smile that was both knowing and sad. "The question isn't who I am," he said softly. "The question is, who are you now?" And in that moment, the officer understood that nothing would ever be the same again. The officer lay on the cold stone floor, his chest rising and falling erratically. His mind swirled with confusion, his senses overwhelmed by what he had just experienced. He had felt something powerful, when he touched that crystal. It was as if the entire world had shifted, leaving him in a space he could no longer comprehend. But the worst part? He hadn't been alone when it happened. The homeless man had been standing there, watching him. There was no way he hadn't seen the officer's reaction. He must have known what would happen. But how? The officer pushed himself up shakily, his head still spinning. He needed answers. This had gone far beyond any typical police case. This was something else entirely. What the hell is going on? What the hell is going on? He muttered under his breath, wiping the sweat from his brow. He looked around the chamber, still disoriented but trying to make sense of the strange symbols etched into the walls. They weren't just random marks, they felt purposeful, deliberate. Each symbol seemed to pulse with a strange, unexplainable energy. And the crystal, the way it had hummed when he touched it, the way it had seemed to call to him. It was more than just a physical object. It felt alive. He turned to look for the homeless man, but there was no sign of him. The room was empty as it had been when the officer had first entered. The man was gone. "Where did he go?" the officer whispered. He stood up fully now, his legs unsteady, his heart still racing from the ordeal. He had to find the man, he was the key. There was no way he would leave this place without some sort of explanation. But as the officer moved toward the door, a strange sound filled the room, like a whisper. Soft at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't in a language he could understand, but it felt almost like it was directed at him. The sound seemed to come from the very walls, as though the room itself was alive, communicating something to him. A shiver ran down his spine. He turned back toward the crystal, the energy it gave off now seeming even stronger than before. The officer didn't know what to do, didn't know what he had just stumbled into. But whatever it was, he had a feeling it was bigger than anything he could have imagined. With no other choice, the officer approached the crystal again. This time, he moved more cautiously, his fingers hovering just above its surface. The faint glow it gave off illuminated the room in an ethereal, otherworldly light. It wasn't just a light, it was a presence, a pull that seemed to be drawing him in, coaxing him to touch it again. He hesitated. But then, without thinking, he placed his hand on the crystal once more. Instantly, a flood of images assaulted his mind. They weren't just visions, they were memories. His memories, yes, but not as he remembered them. They were twisted, distorted, like looking at himself through someone else's eyes. He saw his younger self, a man full of hope and ambition, walking through the streets of the city. But then the images shifted, showing him walking down the same streets, but with a sense of dread on his face. People in the city avoided him. Their eyes followed him, whispers echoing in his ears, their words unintelligible, but unmistakably filled with fear. The officer pulled his hand back in shock, the images vanishing as suddenly as they had appeared. He was left gasping for air, as though he had just run a marathon. His hands shook as he struggled to steady himself. He wasn't sure if what he had just seen was real or just a trick of his mind. But there was no denying the impact those images had on him. He could still feel the weight of the fear, the sense of isolation and confusion that had come with them. The officer turned, his eyes scanning the room. He needed answers. But how could he understand what had just happened? Before he could make sense of it, the sound returned, the whispers, now louder, more distinct. The officer's heart raced as he turned toward the doorway, half expecting to see the homeless man standing there. But the man was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the whispers seemed to be coming from all around him, no, not just from the walls, but from somewhere deep within the earth itself. They weren't random words or phrases. They were coherent, like a chant, as though the room was trying to communicate something ancient, something important. The officer stood frozen, trying to make out the words, but they remained just out of reach, like a distant memory he couldn't quite recall. And then, without warning, the ground beneath him trembled. The officer stumbled back, his heart pounding. Was it an earthquake? No, this felt different. The vibrations didn't seem to come from above or below, but from within the very core of the room itself. He looked toward the crystal again, and what he saw shocked him to his core. The crystal was no longer glowing faintly. It was pulsing with energy, growing brighter with every passing second. It was no longer just a passive object, it was alive, reacting to the officer's presence. And then, the officer realized something terrifying. The crystal wasn't just calling to him. It was calling to something else. A shadow moved in the corner of the room. A tall figure, silhouetted against the now blinding light from the crystal. The officer couldn't make out its features, but it wasn't human. Who are you?" the officer asked, his voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it moved closer, the energy in the room growing stronger, almost suffocating. The officer took a step back, his body instinctively reacting to the threat, but there was nowhere to run. The walls were closing in on him, the air growing thick with tension. And then, as suddenly as the figure had appeared, it was gone. The room fell silent again. The officer's breath came in short gasps. He looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But everything seemed to be shifting, changing, as if reality itself was bending and warping before his eyes. The whispers faded into the background, but they left something behind, a feeling, like a presence. A warning. The officer wasn't alone. And whatever force had been pulling him toward the well, toward the crystal, had only just begun to reveal its true power. But just as he thought he could process everything, the homeless man's voice echoed in his mind once again. "It's not the well you need to fear," the words rang clear in his ears. "It's the answers you'll find." The officer shuddered, suddenly. Understanding the depth of those words. He wasn't just uncovering a mystery. He was standing at the edge of something far more dangerous, something far more ancient than he could have ever imagined. And now, the only way out was to keep going deeper. The officer stood still, his hands trembling as the weight of what had just transpired crashed down on him. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. Every breath seemed harder to take, as if the very atmosphere was closing in, suffocating him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the blur of images, the strange energy, and the chilling presence he had felt. But the more he thought about it, the more questions emerged, and the fewer answers he had. He turned back toward the crystal. It sat there in the center of the room, glowing with an eerie intensity, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. He felt it pulling him again, compelling him to approach, to touch it once more. But he was afraid. No, not afraid, terrified. He had felt that power, that searing energy coursing through him the moment he had touched the crystal. It was a feeling he couldn't shake, a sense that something inside him had changed. Something inside him had been unlocked. But he had no idea what that meant. But despite the fear, he knew one thing. He had no choice. He had to understand. The questions in his mind were like a fire that couldn't be extinguished. What was this crystal? What was its connection to the well? And why was the homeless man leading him here, to this place? The officer took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving the crystal. He didn't want to go near it. But the pull, the magnetic, undeniable pull, was stronger than his fear. He reached out cautiously, his fingers hovering just above the surface of the crystal. And then, the room seemed to shift. The whispers returned, louder this time, their rhythm syncopated with the pulse of the crystal. The officer closed his eyes, trying to block them out, but they grew louder still, a chorus of voices, urgent and pleading. They were words he couldn't understand, but they felt important. Necessary. As if they were trying to warn him, or to guide him. Please, the officer whispered, his voice barely audible, please, just let me understand. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cool surface of the crystal. Instantly, the ground beneath him seemed to give way, and he stumbled, falling forward into the glow. The light surrounded him, engulfing him entirely, and for a moment, he lost all sense of time. The room disappeared, replaced by a vast, endless void. He felt himself falling, no, not falling, but descending, through layers of darkness. There was no up, no down, no direction. Just the weight of the darkness pressing against him. But then, in the distance, he saw a flicker of light. A figure. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadow, its face hidden. But as it moved closer, the officer felt a sudden jolt of recognition. He had seen this figure before. It was the homeless man. But now, he was different. Taller. More imposing. His eyes burned with a fire the officer couldn't describe. You've come far, the homeless man's voice echoed through the void, but you're not yet ready. The officer's heart raced. Not ready? For what? The figure moved closer, and the officer could feel the intensity of its gaze. For the truth. Truth, the officer repeated, his voice shaking. What truth? What are you talking about? The homeless man stood before him now, his eyes glowing with a faint, otherworldly light. You've been searching for answers, he said, his voice deep and resonant, but you've been looking in the wrong places. The officer shook his head. I don't understand. What is all of this? What are you doing to me? You're not the first to ask those questions, the homeless man said softly. But the truth is not something you can simply ask for. It must be earned. Earned? The officer's chest tightened. How? What do I have to do? You must descend, the man said simply. Deeper. Into the well. Into yourself. Before the officer could respond, the figure raised a hand, and the darkness around them began to warp, the void shifting like a living thing. The officer stumbled backward as the ground beneath him seemed to crack open, revealing a deep, endless chasm. Wait, the officer cried, panic rising in his chest. I can't. But the figure was already gone. The officer's vision blurred, and the light from the crystal faded, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. He fell, faster now, deeper into the abyss, his body twisting and turning in the darkness. And then, with a sudden, violent jolt, the officer landed hard on the ground. He gasped for air, his body aching, his limbs trembling. Slowly, he pushed himself up, his eyes struggling to adjust to the new surroundings. He was no longer in the chamber with the crystal. He was somewhere else, somewhere darker, colder. The officer stood in the center of what appeared to be an ancient temple. The walls were covered in strange, cryptic symbols, much like those he had seen in the chamber before. But these were different. These symbols were etched into the stone, as though carved by hands long forgotten. They seemed to pulse with a dark energy, drawing the officer's gaze deeper, urging him to understand. He could feel it, the power. It was all around him, suffocating him, pulling at him from every direction. His heart raced, and the air seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive with every passing second. It felt as though the very stone walls were alive, watching him, waiting for him to make his next move. A voice echoed through the chamber. "You're not alone, officer." The officer whipped around, his eyes scanning the room. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice rough with fear. From the shadows, a figure emerged. At first, the officer thought it was the homeless man. But as the figure stepped into the dim light, he saw it wasn't him at all. It was someone else, someone he couldn't recognize. A woman, her face partially obscured by a hood. "I'm not here to hurt you," the woman said, her voice soft but steady. "But you're in danger. You've come too far." The officer took a step back, his mind racing. Danger? From what? The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached into the folds of her cloak and pulled out an ancient-looking scroll. She unfurled it, revealing more strange symbols, even more complex than the ones etched into the walls. "This," the woman said, "is what they don't want you to know." The officer stepped closer, squinting at the scroll. It was covered in markings, some of which seemed to shift before his eyes, like they were alive, changing shape with each glance. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and the woman allowed him to take the scroll. "What is this?" the officer asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What does it mean?" "It's the key," the woman replied. "To everything. To the truth you've been searching for. But be careful. Once you see it, you can't unsee it." The officer's heart raced as he read the symbols. They were unlike anything he had ever seen, ancient, forbidden, and powerful. Each one seemed to carry its own weight, its own significance. The symbols didn't just tell a story, they held a secret. "What is this secret?" the officer asked, his voice hoarse. "The truth about the crystal," the woman said, stepping back into the shadows. "About the well. And about you." Before the officer could ask another question, the woman's form began to fade, her body dissolving into the air like smoke. "No," the officer cried, reaching out in desperation. "Don't leave me here. I need to know." But the woman was gone. And in her place stood a single symbol, glowing faintly against the dark stone walls. The officer stared at it, his mind reeling. What was this all leading to? What had he stumbled into? He had come seeking answers. But now, it seemed that the deeper he went, the less he understood. And yet, he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't stop now. The officer stood in the dimly lit chamber, the ancient scroll clutched tightly in his hands. His heart pounded in his chest, his breathing shallow and quick. The symbols on the scroll still burned in his mind, shifting and rearranging before his eyes like they were living creatures. Each time he looked at them, they seemed to change, their meaning elusive, slipping through his fingers like smoke. He glanced up at the walls around him. The symbols there were the same, some familiar, some entirely new, each one pulsing with an eerie energy that seemed to vibrate with the very core of his being. It was as though the entire room, the very stones themselves, were alive, breathing, waiting for him to make his next move. The weight of it all pressed down on him, suffocating him. He had come seeking answers, but now, with the scroll in his hands and the truth lurking just beyond his grasp, he wasn't sure he wanted to know what lay beneath the surface. He could feel the danger that was now a part of him, the invisible force that was drawing him deeper into this nightmare. The whispers, too, had returned. They weren't just words anymore, they were thoughts, images, emotions that flooded his mind, overwhelming him. It was as if the room, the symbols, the very air itself were trying to communicate something, something that was beyond his understanding, beyond his ability to comprehend. And yet, it was all so clear, so vivid. The sense that something larger than life was unfolding before him, just out of reach. He turned the scroll over in his hands, his fingers tracing the markings. Every line seemed to have a purpose, every curve a direction. But there was one symbol, one central mark, that seemed to stand out more than the rest. It glowed faintly, a soft, pulsating light that mirrored the rhythm of his heartbeat. It was an eye. Not just any eye, but an all-seeing eye. The symbol was ancient, its significance tied to the mysteries of the past, to the knowledge hidden deep within forgotten cultures and lost civilizations. The officer had seen this symbol before, not just in books or old records, but in the visions he had experienced when he first touched the crystal. The officer's hands trembled as he stared at the symbol. There was something haunting about it, something that sent a chill down his spine. It was as if the eye was watching him, seeing into the very depths of his soul. The sense of being observed, of being powerless in the face of some vast, cosmic force, was overwhelming. "Why?" the officer whispered, his voice breaking the silence. "Why is this happening to me?" The room seemed to answer, the air vibrating with an energy he couldn't explain. He stepped forward, his instincts urging him to get closer to the eye symbol, to understand it. As he moved, the air seemed to shift, the temperature dropping rapidly, until his breath became visible in the cold, damp atmosphere. Without thinking, he placed his hand on the wall. The instant his skin touched the stone, a jolt of electricity shot through him, and the world around him seemed to warp. Images flooded his mind, visions of the past, flashes of moments he didn't remember experiencing. He saw himself walking down the same streets from his earlier vision, but now, he was not alone. He was with a group of people, a team. His colleagues. They were discussing something, something urgent, something important. But the words were lost to him, drowned out by a deafening hum that filled his ears. The faces of his colleagues twisted and blurred, their features indistinct, but their eyes, those eyes, he recognized them. They were the same eyes he had seen earlier, in the homeless man, in the symbol. They were watching him. All of them. And they were not human. The officer gasped, pulling his hand away from the wall. He stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. The images vanished as quickly as they had appeared, but the feeling of dread lingered, gnawing at his gut. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself, trying to steady his breathing. "This isn't real. It can't be." But deep down, he knew it was real. The visions, the whispers, the unexplainable energy, it was all too vivid to be a figment of his imagination. And as much as he wanted to deny it, he could feel the pull of something beyond his understanding, something ancient, something powerful. The officer's eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could explain what he had just experienced. There had to be something here, something that would help him make sense of it all. And then, his gaze landed on the well. It was still there, waiting in the center of the chamber, its dark, yawning mouth like an open wound in the earth. It seemed to call to him, its presence undeniable, like a black hole drawing everything into its depths. The officer knew that the well was the key. It always had been. The crystal, the scroll, the symbols, everything had led him here. But what was it? What was hidden in the well that had caused this entire sequence of events? He approached the well cautiously, his heart racing as he peered into its inky darkness. There was no telling what lay beneath, but he could feel the pull of it, an insistent force that refused to let him turn away. He reached down, his fingers brushing the edge of the well. The moment his hand touched the stone, the ground shook beneath him, and the walls of the chamber groaned in protest. The officer stumbled back, his breath coming in short gasps as he tried to regain his balance. The air grew thick, oppressive, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. "Not yet," the voice seemed to say. "You're not ready." But the officer couldn't stop himself. He leaned forward, peering into the depths of the well, his eyes straining to see what lay beyond the darkness. And then, with a suddenness that made his heart stop, he saw it. A figure. Rising from the depths of the well. The officer froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadows, its form indistinct, but there was something about it, something that struck a chord deep within him. And then, the figure stepped forward, emerging from the darkness, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "Who are you?" the officer whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised its hand, pointing directly at him. The officer's body went rigid as a cold, icy feeling spread through his chest. The symbol, the all-seeing eye, flashed in his mind again, and the officer felt a surge of terror that nearly paralyzed him. "Answer me," the officer demanded, his voice shaking. The figure tilted its head, as though considering him. Then, without a word, it stepped aside, revealing something behind it. Something that made the officer's blood run cold. A mirror. But it wasn't just any mirror. The reflection that stared back at the officer wasn't his own. It was someone else, a man he didn't recognize, a man who looked nothing like him, but who shared his eyes, his expressions, his movements. The officer recoiled in shock. "No," he whispered, taking a step back. "This can't be me." The reflection smiled at him, a twisted, knowing grin that sent a chill down the officer's spine. "It's always been you," the figure said softly, its voice a whisper that echoed in the officer's mind. "You've been running from the truth for too long." The officer's world shattered.